Good evening, I'm Eleanor Oldroyd. This is a 5 Live boxing special in the week that Ricky Hatton has begun to fight his demons after being filmed snorting cocaine. Hatton is the latest in a long line of boxers struggling to face up to life outside the ring.
And a left hand from Manny Pacquiao, and Ricky Hatton is out and flat on his back. The referee waves his arms, doesn't even start the count, and it is all over.
When he had defeats, he just thought that he'd let him down, and he got more and more and more depressed, which led him to drinking more and more.
Ricky Hatton says he's devastated and distraught after being secretly filmed allegedly snorting cocaine.
Yeah, I spoke to Ricky just an hour or so ago. He's very upset. He's in a very bad place.
There is nothing like it. You walk away from it, it is impossible to let it go. It's impossible. Nothing will ever replace what it was like in the ring for the rest of your days.
I stopped training for a year and they sectioned me because I think once you stop something, the tension builds up. You've got to just keep yourself on the move and keep yourself occupied, you know what I mean?
I was either trying to fill it with something else. I was either filling it with women going out clubbing, partying. Something was missing in my life. You've got to be strong, and I wasn't. I was very weak.
Coming up, we'll hear more from Nigel Benn and Frank Bruno, two British boxers whose success wasn't enough to give them happy retirements. But let's say good evening first to the former world super middleweight champion Richie Woodhall, 5 Live's boxing commentator Mike Costello, and boxing writer and broadcaster Steve Bunce. Good evening to all three of you.
Hi, Ellie. Good evening. Good evening.
Now, Mike, let's talk to you first of all. We've known all about Ricky Hatton's drinking for many years. So did you get a sense of sad inevitability when you saw the front page of the paper last weekend?
Well, as you say, we've known about the drinking for so long, but it seems to me in boxing circles this week that the surprise about the cocaine story is that it didn't surface even earlier. And we're going to be talking tonight about problems that boxers face in their lives after boxing, but it seems the root of Hatton's problem came with life during boxing, and you know, this drinking problem, as we now know it to be, and have known it to be perfectly honest for some time, was the root of the problem he's facing now, fueled his cocaine addiction, if that's what it is now, and has led to these huge problems. And you asked the question as to why didn't somebody around him ask the questions and tell him to just slow down some years ago. But then when you look at stories like this, and when men like Hatton reach the status and the stature that they do, maybe he wouldn't have listened to anybody anyway. So inevitable, possibly sad, definitely.
Well, Steve, you've been talking to somebody who's closer to him than anybody, his dad, Ray.
Yeah, I've spoken to Ray a couple of times this week and missed him and left messages, and they're heartbroken. They did an interview on Sky. It was an interview I think with Radio Manchester we listened to there. They did an interview on Sky TV where both he breaks down and his wife Carol, Ricky's mother, is close to tears, and all they're doing is they're going up and down to where he's in rehab at the moment. And to be honest with you, there's a lot to be debated about this rehab, this whole cosmetic rehab. You know, anyone's got a fault. You know, he's a drinker, he does coke, he does this, he does that. Oh, stick him in rehab. Well, yeah, it's not some giant plaster. It's not some instant plaster you get at the door and you come out 14 days later with a 6-pack, 2-stone lighter and happier and healthier. It doesn't work that way. And I think the rehab is I'm not a big lover of rehab for cases like Ricky here, because I think there's alternatives. I really do.
Well, that's interesting, Steve, that so many people this week have been saying maybe this is the best thing that could happen to him, but that's a giant-sized presumption that he gets through all this.
Of course it is. The thing with addictions, Mike, it's quite simple. Whether you're a drinker or whether you use cocaine, a lot of cocaine, or you're a cocaine addict, to really want to get better, you've got to be hitting some fairly big lows. You know, you've got to be crumbling, you've got to be suffering. You don't just drink 12 pints and think it's normal and then do a couple of lines of cocaine and think, oh, I'll go in, I'll sort out the cocaine abuse, because that's what it is at the level, the amounts that Ricky's been doing. It just doesn't work that way. 2 weeks in one of the Priory's clinics up in the northwest is not going to be the solution here. I'm absolutely convinced. I know we'll talk about this a bit later on. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
Maybe let's hope it's a step in the right direction. Richie, now you've gone on to become a respected boxing commentator and coach since you retired, but did you find your transition from the ring to retirement and to a new career an easy one?
Yes and no, really. I was very, very lucky in that when I retired from boxing, the BBC called me and asked to go and work for them, so I was lucky in that respect. But it was very interesting listening to what Barry McGuigan said there about, you know, you'd never ever lose that buzz and there's nothing ever replace it, and he's totally true, because once you've been a boxer, once you've been a world champion, then you know you've hit the very top. You've earned good money, but you've been in the limelight as well, and it is a buzz that you want to keep. But at some time it's going to go away, because you're not going to stay there forever. And obviously Ricky Hatton, you know, great fighter that he was, he reached the top. And of course Joe Calzaghe as well has had problems, and so yeah, for me, I was lucky, but secretly, yeah, I mean, I wanted to box on, of course I did, but I knew that it was over. I knew I couldn't perform at that level anymore, and it's the hardest decision that you have to make, because you have to admit it to yourself, and that's where the mental strength come in. You have to be a man, and you have to say, well, I'm finished, I can't perform at this level anymore, and that's the most difficult thing to accept, and to make that decision to yourself that it's over.
Yeah, because I mean, this is the interesting thing with Ricky Hatton, isn't it? Because his career is, to all intents and purposes, we've talked about it many times on 5 Live Boxing, it's continuing. He hadn't actually announced his retirement, even though, you know, probably we thought that he was getting close to it. But obviously the problems haven't come with retirement. They've come throughout.
Well, quite the reverse. You know, we talked on this show in February of this year when he said, I'm going to go away to Australia for a month, I'm going to go on a talking and drinking tour, and he said that, I'll go on a talking and drinking tour, have a good time, I'm going to come back and get in the gym. We both sat here, Mike and I, and we just said it won't happen that way, and I think you were in that chair and you said why, and I said because when he comes back and when he gets in the gym, it's got nothing to do with Ricky. If his parents and his brother don't think he's pulling it out, don't think he's got it in him, they will stop him. And sure as eggs are eggs, in about April we heard that they had stopped him from continuing. Then he went on a massive bender over in Tenerife. But to get back to your point, Ellie, you're absolutely right. I think, listen, if we can clear the air here, let's establish something. Whenever anybody has an addiction, okay, and when it's first properly diagnosed and out in the open, the first thing that happens is everybody, including that person, everyone around him, goes into deep denial. And we've got some serious denial here, and one of the things that I think needs to be looked at, especially with regard to Ricky Hatton, Mick, is that this isn't something that's been the last 7 or 8 or 9 months. This wasn't caused by Manny Pacquiao's wicked fists at the MGM that horrible night, brilliant night in May of last year.
And you know, when you hear of stories and deal with stories like this, you start to reflect and look back at all the times you've been in Hatton's company or whoever it is, and you wonder, did you see signs? And even just 2 weeks ago on our last 5 Live Boxing, we ran towards the end of a show a very short clip of an interview that he'd done that day with BBC Radio Manchester to say basically that he was giving up. He said, if I had to put my last pound on it, I'd say, no, I'll never return to the ring. The following week, in his own column in the Manchester Evening News, he pretty much said, that's nonsense, and his quote was, until you hear it from the horse's mouth, I'm not retired. So when you start to look at really confusing messages like that, virtually on the back of each other, then you start to think, well, something was going on.
Back to you in Richie, let me ask you this. Steve has talked about people being in denial about what's happened to Ricky Hatton. Do you think that Ricky Hatton was more in denial than anyone else?
Yeah, I think so, and also in denial, obviously, about his career, in that, you know, it's over, in my opinion. I don't think Ricky Hatton should ever box again, to be quite honest. I don't think he will recover from this in terms of being a boxer in the ring. I don't think he'll ever reach the heights that he did. I think there were signs in certain contests. I remember when he boxed at the Manchester City Stadium back in, I think it was May 2008 against Juan Lascano. He won the fight on points, but there were signs there that Ricky wasn't just quite right, in my opinion. It was an opinion that we shared at ringside also. He obviously then went on to beat Paulie Malignaggi, and then he obviously got beat against Pacquiao. But yeah, I think he's probably in denial, and I'll tell you, that's what I'm talking about. It's always the boxer, we all say it, don't we? It's always the boxer who's the last one to know that it's over, and this is a typical case. Ricky doesn't feel that it's over yet, and with him, as what Mike has just said there about that thing he had in the column saying that, until you hear it from the horse's mouth. So there's still a question mark over whether he's actually going to come back, because he cannot let go of boxing.
But Richie, are you really the last to know? When you're in the gym, when you're doing your runs, when you're hitting the bags and the pads, and you must feel that the timing's gone, the power's gone, or at least that it's going.
That is very, very hard to accept that, Mike, and it's very, very hard
but you do,
to admit
you know
it to
it's
yourself. Well, I was lucky enough that I realised it was over for me when I boxed Joe Calzaghe, and he beat me. And obviously Joe Calzaghe was one of the greatest super middleweights in the history of boxing, but I just felt that I wasn't there in terms of my timing, my power, my speed. He beat me and I was beaten by a better man, but at the end of the day it wasn't the Richie Woodhall, and I knew then that I just couldn't perform at that level, and that's why I turned away from the game. But it's very, very difficult to admit it to yourself, and a lot of fighters who come back, they just can't admit it. And I'll tell you something else as well. When you retire from boxing, the big problem is as well, it's a youthful chapter in your life that finishes, and that's extremely difficult to accept, because we all like to think we're still young and we can perform in the ring, and we can do it, and we can throw so many punches a minute, and time catches up on us all, and we have to admit it that it's over.
And of course the self-belief that a boxer needs is part of what makes him want to continue. But when we were speaking about denial, Richie, as well, if you look at Hatton's responses to his 2 defeats and how he just cannot bring himself to accept them, maybe it's because he's had this long unbeaten run. But to those of us on the other side of the ropes, it's almost impossible to work out how he believes he should have beaten Floyd Mayweather. He says that was the fault of the referee. He says that knockout defeat against Manny Pacquiao was because of a bad camp. And that's when you start to think, is this a man who's just got indefatigable self-belief, or is it somebody who's delusional?
I think, Mike, many of us around the ringside, we knew he was up against obviously Mayweather and Pacquiao. Put hand on heart, I didn't think he was going to beat Pacquiao. I think we all said at ringside, he's got a puncher's chance, but this guy is in another league. And let's face it, the thing is with Ricky, what Ricky has to accept, he's up against the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Bar none. People say Mayweather, but Pacquiao, then, he's ranked as the best pound-for-pound. So at ringside, I think it was Stevie there, you was there, myself, and we all agreed, I think it was, that Pacquiao was going to win the fight.
No, sorry, Ellie, just 1 second, just quickly before we move on. Mike, you'll also remember that when he came back after the Mayweather fight, you and I had a bit of a run-in, not with him, but with the guy who was his American promoter, who tried to reshape history, tried to tell us Ricky was leading going into X amount of the round, tried to tell us the fight was in the balance before Mayweather caught him with a lucky shot. That was Richard Schaefer, and I'm not anti-Richard Schaefer, who runs Golden Boy, but you and I both looked at each other in some nightclub. It was in the daytime, I have to stress, where the press conference was taking place. We both looked at each other because we knew this was just utter rubbish. Now, what's really scary is he told 15 or 20 members of the British press who had diligently written it down until you and I challenged him to said that's not the case. He took a hiding from about round 4 because he fought without his brain. Ricky and some of the family didn't talk to me, I don't know about you, for about a year after that fight, Mike.
And that's one of the problems which I just touched on earlier on, that you've got to have somebody around you who's going to say no when everyone else is saying yes. And there wasn't that figure around Hatton, clearly, whether it was in terms of the choice of fights or in terms of his drinking and the way he was ballooning up in between fights.
I want to move on, because we're going to talk more to Richie. I'm fascinated to hear how he coped with life after he stepped outside the ring.